It's nice.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been a journalist since 1971. I was on WNEW radio doing stringing, news reporting in 1978 at the age of 21. Among the people I interviewed, Ronald Reagan, Ted Kennedy. I covered the Democratic National Convention in 1980. And I covered the returning hostages from Iran at Stewart Air Force Base in Newburgh back in January of 1981. So that's part of my background. I'm an op-ed writer. I do commentaries. I've been on TV, been on radio, written for magazines, and most of the places I work for are now out of business. One place that's not out of business is the Yogi Berra Museum. And that is in Little Falls, New Jersey, on the campus of Montclair State University. And I was fortunate enough to speak at Yogi's place a couple times a year over a 6-7 year period. And Yogi would pat me on the back afterwards. He would come to virtually every one of my talks and say, "Good job, kid. Good job, kid." Yogi, of course, in the 1950s was everywhere. He was on TV playing in World Series games, and he was on commercials on TV, and the Yogiisms became a very popular thing, made popular by his buddy Joe Garagiola from St. Louis, from Dago Hill. Not being political correct, but that's what they called it. And Joe and Yogi had known each other since they were 2 years old.
Evan, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Something happened. Now you're muted.
Okay, how's that?
Better.
I'm back.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's probably Zoom today. That's what happens with Zoom sometimes. But baseball in the culture goes back a long, long way. In fact, it goes back to the 1880s. In 1954, there was a philosopher from France by the name of Jacques Barzun, who noted, whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball. And he also had a suggestion. Don't go to Major League games. You're wasting your time at Major League games. Go down, watch the Sandlot, watch the kids on the Sandlot teams. Go watch a high school game or go watch an industrial league game, because those are the guys who are in the community who learned about baseball and learned about America, and America and baseball are intertwined. Barzun, by the end of his life, saw the corporatization of baseball and didn't like baseball anymore by the 21st century because it sold out. It became too corporate. Casey at the Bat, 1880s, written by an anonymous author with the San Francisco Examiner. Now, that newspaper I happen to write for as well, the San Francisco Examiner. The anonymous writer wrote for it in the 19th century. I wrote for it in the 21st century. The anonymous writer, Ernest Thayer. He was a columnist with the San Francisco Examiner between 1886 and 1888. And he came up with this little thing called Casey at the Bat. It's printed on June 3rd, 1888, but he doesn't take credit for it. Doesn't tell you anything about it. We don't know who Casey is. Was Casey King Kong Kelly, who played in New England? Thayer came from New England. Or was it somebody from Stockton, California? We don't know anything about that either. We could assume it was King Kong Kelly. We could assume it's somebody from Stockton. But Thayer really never talked very much about this poem that he wrote. I was in 4th grade, and Miss Alexander was my teacher. It was 1965, and I'm going to PS 151 in Queens. And Miss Alexander was your typical old maid teacher from that era. When women teachers in New York City were not allowed to get married. She had the requisite blue hair. She had the white blouse. She had the blue skirt. She had a tissue stuck up here in case her nose ran and she had to wipe her nose or anything of that nature. But she gives us an assignment. I don't think many people give assignments as teachers anymore. In fact, I've been asking this question of teachers and they don't do this anymore. But she gave us the assignment because baseball was so ingrained in America. Analyze what Casey at the bat was. Analyze it. Tell me what it was. And me, being 9 years old at the time, just thought, well, he's a lousy baseball player. He has a chance to get up, win the game in the ninth inning, and strikes out. There's no joy in Mudville for the mighty Casey who struck out. Miss Alexander didn't buy that explanation at all. She said to me, no, it's not about that at all. It's about man's failures. That man, no matter what he wants to do and what he strives to do, ultimately is going to fail most of the time. And in baseball, you fail 70% of the time and you make it into the Hall of Fame. I just thought he was a lousy baseball player, striking out, with the game on the line. Thayer would eventually claim ownership to the poem, and he would do so in 1895 at a Harvard class reunion. This is already ingrained in the culture. Casey at the bat. But there's a reason why it was ingrained in the culture, because it didn't have anything to do with the San Francisco Examiner. I could tell you, as somebody who writes op-ed pieces, you write it, it goes out, and it's dead. Nobody really refers to much stuff afterwards, particularly in newspapers. Only once in a while there's an op-ed that's remembered by somebody. But this one was. And the reason why? It was this guy, DeWolf Hopper. Now, DeWolf Hopper was the father of Heather Hopper, but DeWolf Hopper was an old-time vaudevillian burlesque actor who takes really ownership of this poem that he doesn't write. And within about 2 months, he is performing on the stage Casey at the Bat, dramatically performing Casey at the Bat. And it's performed for the first time on August 14th. That's in 1888. It's estimated that Hopper performed this poem more than 10,000 times on the stage, on record, and also in a silent movie. And that was done in the 1920s. So he's doing this for the next 12 years in the 19th century, and then for the first fifth of the 20th century. So he did this a long, long time, and he made it very famous, except he's not the first one who would commit the poem to recorded sound. Now, that's the Springfield Library, Springfield, New Jersey. And I do a number of talks, and I happened to be at the Springfield Library, and this was in January of 2019. And in that library, there was a guy who lived in town who was a hermit who collected a lot of things, and he passes away, and he's got all these things in his house. Among them is a cylinder, which he played, or it could be played, sound could be played on there, and that particular cylinder does work because the Mrs. Spindle, who runs the library, showed me that this thing works by, and what's on there is a John Philip Sousa march. But in 1893, there's a guy by the name of Russell Hunting, and there he is, Russell Hunting. Russell Hunting was an actor. He also played around with sound. And he took this poem. Now, you got to remember, Hopper is performing around the country, bringing Casey at the Bat and baseball to vaudeville stages. This guy likes the poem, and he decides in 1893 that he is going to record it on one of those cylinders. He does it in 1893. He does it in 1898. Hey, the mighty Casey is struck out. Hunting thought that Casey was probably Irish. And because he was probably Irish, Hunting does the poem twice on those cylinders in an Irish, heavy Irish brogue. John Kaiser in 1905 would record it for Edison. This thing is now so ingrained in the culture. And Hopper's version would be recorded for Victor, RCA Victor, his master's voice, Nipper the dog. But that doesn't come out until 1906. So this thing is kicking around since 1893, 13 years, and there's a recording that you could bring home and you could listen to it in your house. And if you wanted to listen to it in your house, chances are, in those days, you listened to it on an old crank-up Victrola. This is in Sagway, Quebec. I was there last year. I speak on cruise ships, and this guy has this garage that people just go through, and you take a look at some of the stuff in the garage, and I said, I need that for my baseball talk, because if you put down Hopper's version of the record, or Kaiser's version of the record, Kaiser, of course, for Edison, you could play it on there. So people at home could play Casey at the Bat whenever they wanted to if they bought a record. Hopper would commit the verse to film, 1922, Lead the Forest, short film, silent film. Wallace Beery starred in a 1927 version of the film. Bob Hope's Second Banana. Jerry Colonna recorded a rendition for Disney, which later provided the basis for a 1946 Disney cartoon. It gets into cartoons. That's how well known it is in the culture. Jackie Gleason performs it on his TV show in the 1950s. Johnny Bench, Tug McGraw, George Steinbrenner, and Billy Martin. Steinbrenner and Martin together raising money for the Tampa PBA, the Police Benevolent Association. They voiced the poem in orchestral settings. This poem is well known, and it's part of the American culture. And it would continue to be part of the American culture until at least 1964, as far as I know, 65, because I read it in Miss Alexander's class. Now, if I was with you live, I would be asking you this question. Does that sign ring a bell? Because that sign did stir the interest of a couple of songwriters in 1908. That sign is actually a placard that was in the New York City subway, probably in Manhattan, because the New York Giants played at the end of the subway up on 155th Street and 8th Avenue, depending on what subway you were on. It's a ball game today at the Polo Grounds. And it was among the signs. I don't know if Dr. Zinsmore had his sign up there at that point for zip removal. It seems like he had lots of signs up there for zip removal, but that was up there. Ball game today at the Polo Grounds. Baseball games in those days started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No lights. Games were over within an hour and a half. A long game would last 2 hours tops. So there's this songwriter, and the songwriter is named Jack Norwith. He is the guy who puts music to songs. And he sees his buddy, Albert Montilzer, and says, I got an idea. I saw this sign today, ball game today at the Polo Grounds. What do you think? And Montilzer comes up with an idea, and it becomes, take me out to the ball game. And there is Harry Carey, the late Chicago Cubs announcer. What you don't see in this picture are Harry's 6 best friends named Bud, 12 ounces, maybe 8 ounces of beer. And Harry used to indulge in the sponsor's product while he was on WGN doing the games, initially with Jimmy Pearsall. In between the top of the 7th inning and the bottom of the 7th inning, Harry Carey used to, and probably the worst singing voice you could imagine, blurt out, take me out to the ball game, take me out to the crowd, buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I ever get back, for we will root for the home team. They don't win. It's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. What is this song all about? What did Albert Montilzer and Jack Norwith come up with? Well, if you know anything about the song, it's in 3 stanzas. The first stanza is about Katie Casey. She's the one who sings the song. Katie Casey has the baseball bug, and she has the baseball fever bad, and she loves baseball. Now, I told you, game started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We don't know much about Katie Casey, except we think she's a young lady either from Brooklyn or from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, or thereabouts. But if she was from Brooklyn, it would be Ebbets Field or the Brooklyn team. So it's probably the New York Giants, because Polo Ground, baseball game today at the Polo Grounds. But Katie Casey's going on a date with somebody. We don't know if it's her boyfriend. We think it's her boyfriend. Could be her husband. Could be a brother. Could be a friend. And she's on the subway and she's talking to this guy. And they're talking about what they should do today. And she says, I want to go to a baseball game. And he's not too interested in going to a baseball game. She said, I want to go to a baseball game. Highly unusual. Women in 1908, when the song was written, were not seen at baseball games. It was thought of as unladylike, and baseball players were a bunch of ruffians, and ladies should not be at the game. But she's persisting, and she says, I want to go to the baseball game. The boyfriend, whoever it is, no, 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 no. Finally, she can't take it anymore. In the middle of wherever she is, she screams out, take me out to the ball game, take me out to the crowd, buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if we ever get back, for we will root, root, root for the home team. They don't win. It's a shame. Where it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. There's a third stanza. We don't know what happened to Katie Casey, nor do we know what happened to whatever friend she had. We don't know if she went to a baseball game or not. But we do know that a couple things about Katie Casey in the third stanza of the baseball song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. We do know that she is a rabid baseball fan, and she knows all the players. Yeah, she knows all the players. The players don't have any names on the back. They don't have numbers on the back, but she knows all the players, and she knows how to get them going. Well, I don't know how she knows how to get them going, whether it's the Bull Durham Baseball Annie, Susan Sarandon, or if it's some other way. But she is a baseball fan. Now, last year in the Washington Post, there was an op-ed piece that was written, and it was written by a woman who analyzed this song from a different context. She looked at this song. Remember, I told you women didn't go to the baseball games in 1908, particularly by themselves or suggested. And she looked at it from this context, that Katie Casey was one of the first women who was pushing for some sort of women's liberation, making a decision to go to a baseball game. And Take Me Out to the Baseball Game, which was written in 1908, might have been one of the first women's liberation songs ever, intentionally or unintentionally, probably unintentionally. But Katie Casey was pushing for women's rights in the song, according to this op-ed writer. Might be, I don't analyze songs like that, but who knows, maybe 1908, remember you had a lot of suffragettes running around, and the suffragettes inadvertently led William Howard Taft to start the tradition of throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game by a president, and also the 7th inning stretch, all on April 14th, 1910, all because Taft had to run away from the Oval Office because the suffragettes were meeting with him and pushing upon him, we want to vote. His spirits were lowered. He told his aides, get me out of here, take me out to the ball game, literally. And they did, and that's where those two traditions started, because the women got on his back. The song written 1908 is probably the most famous song, at least in North America. Written in 1908, it is played every day under normal circumstances from late February to the end of the baseball season in October and November, played on organs. People at stadiums, people sing it. Oddly enough, the songwriters Jack Norwith and Albert von Tilzer never saw a baseball game. Didn't see a baseball game. Norwith would see his first baseball game in 1928. Von Tilzer, 1940. The song would become famous. It would take a life of its own, much like Casey at the Bat on the vaudeville stage. Why? Because Norwith's wife, Nora Bayes, sung it on the vaudeville stage. She popularized that song along with another song, Shine On Harvest Moon. Take me out to the ball game indoors on a daily basis in the United States and in Canada. Meanwhile, Shine On Harvest Moon, I don't think you find it very much played these days. Von Tilzer and Norwith are in baseball's Hall of Fame for writing that song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And there's Groucho Marx. That is Night at the Opera. This is how ingrained this song would be. That's 1936. By the way, Take Me Out to the Ball Game was not played at a Major League Baseball park until 1934. World Series game between the St. Louis Cardinals and Detroit Tigers played at Briggs Stadium in Detroit. Groucho Marx, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the 1936 movie. Night at the Opera. Groucho is working for Margaret Dumont, who is the patron of the opera, major patron of this particular opera. They go over to Italy to find the world's greatest tenor so they could bring that tenor back to New York. Meanwhile, Groucho encounters Chico and Harpo on the way, and they have a pretty good singer, Alan Jones, Jack Jones' father, playing the role. And Groucho is smitten by the Alan Jones character in the movie and decides to bring him back along with Chico and Harpo. That movie, the famous stateroom scene where everybody crowds into the stateroom, the steward gets there, everybody falls out of the stateroom. But the opera starts, and these guys have to kill some time because they got to get rid of Margaret Dumont's tenor and get their own tenor in there from Italy, Alan Jones. And they have to waste some time. And how do they do that? Well, Harpo and Chico go down to the orchestra pit, put in sheet music for Take Me Out to the Ball Game. The orchestra goes from the overture right into Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Groucho comes out, peanuts and Cracker Jacks. That's what he's selling. It's ingrained in the culture. Harpo Marx would return to the song on I Love Lucy in 1955, playing it on the harp. It's been featured and continues to be featured in numerous movies and television shows throughout the years. Abbott and Costello. Hey, Abbott. Abbott and Costello. Now, here's a bit of an irony here. If you go up to the Berkshires, there is a baseball museum in North Adams, Massachusetts. And North Adams was the home of Jack Chesborough, who's a baseball Hall of Famer who won 41 games for the New York Highlanders in 1904, the predecessors of the New York Yankees. And in that museum, there is a little article about baseball being played in the Berkshires in around 1792, and how baseball evolved out of a game in England called rounders. The act that Abbott and Costello are doing is a typical act with Who's on First in vaudeville, in burlesque, B-U-R-L-E-S-K, which means that the girls take their clothes off, or B-U-R-L-E-S-Q-U-E, which is a family burlesque show. And the style is called rounders. Baseball comes out of a game called rounders. And basically, it's pretty simple. The straight guy, Bud Abbott, by the way, the straight guy got 60% of the take. The stooge, Costello, got 40% of the take. And that's the way it was, because a good straight man is hard to find. That's the way it was in comedy back in those days. But anyway, it's rounders. And the straight guy is saying things that don't really make sense. And the stooge, in this case Costello, keeps asking questions which sound kind of stupid but aren't kind of stupid, and it goes round and round and round and round and round and round, and it never ends until they come up with a final punchline. Rounders, that's the vaudeville style, the burlesque style of comedy. Abbott and Costello goes back a long time. Rounders, it's where baseball comes from. Of course, this Who's on First is one of the American classics. It is probably the most famous example of rounders in a game that derived from rounders. But it's probably the most famous example of rounders in American comedy history. Who's on First was a type of vaudeville act. Very, very common style. A lot of people tried it. Most people failed at it, including the guy who allegedly wrote the routine, a guy by the name of Mike Musto. He was in St. Louis. He wrote the routine, couldn't get anywhere with it. Now, I have a bunch of friends who are comedians. One of them is a guy by the name of Max Stocelli, who lives near Hartford. And we were talking about this one day, and he says, hey, we all steal from everybody. There's nothing original out there. We all steal. It's Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was up in the Borscht Belt. at the hotels and working the hotels and watching other comics. He basically stole everybody's routine, made it his, because he could do it better than everybody else, and everybody knew it. Musto couldn't do this well. Now, there is a question of whether or not Abbott and Costello ever paid $15 for that routine. My friend John Joseph, who's a comic who lives out in Long Island, whose mentor was Alan King, who you might remember from the Ed Sullivan Show. He said, nah, they gave him $15. But Max says, hey, we're comics, we steal, which means nobody seems to know whether Michael Musto got $15 or not. And there are other people who claim that they wrote the routine. The routine might have been around in the 1920s when Abbott was on the burlesque circuit. He might have done a variation of this in the 1920s. So it was a baseball burlesque routine, maybe. Maybe Abbott did a version of the routine before meeting Costello on the burlesque with the QUE at the end circuit in the early 1930s. They get a hold of this around 1936, 1937. There are a bunch of unknowns. They're not really going anywhere except playing the burlesque circuit, but they get a couple breaks along the way. They get hired by Kate Smith. Kate Smith, back in 1938, God Bless America and all that other stuff, had one of the most popular radio shows going back in those days on CBS. Abbott and Costello start working on the routine and working on the routine and working on the routine. Costello has a writer by the name of John Grant who helps out, and another guy by the name of Will Glickman. They get this thing together and they get on the Kate Smith show in time for spring training, 1938, and the rest is history. It is a smash. They killed. The audience loved it, and they had something that would become comedic gold, absolute comedic gold. They would perform at the White House for Franklin Roosevelt, for Harry Truman, for Dwight Eisenhower. They performed it in the movies. They were on radio. They were on TV performing it. Abbott and Costello were enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame in 1956. And you go up to Cooperstown right now, if it's open, I think it's open right now. I think there's limited capacity, but it might be open. And you go up to a certain area and you hit the button and you can watch the loops of Abbott and Costello. They could do it as short as 1 minute. They could do it as long as 10 minutes. And there is a picture of a baseball player by the name of who played with the Los Angeles Dodgers in the late 2000s, the decade of 2000s. And Vin Scully, the Dodger announcer who started in Brooklyn in 1950 and moved to Los Angeles with the team in 1957, did the first 2 innings, both on TV and radio. And he is staring of the baseball game, play-by-play of the baseball game. And he's staring at his TV monitor. And he looks at the monitor and says, only in the way Vin Scully could say, and now we know the answer to the eternal question of who's on first. There is who. Los Angeles Dodgers had a player by the name of Who, which is a common name in South Korea. He's a South Korean player, or was for the Dodgers about 12 years ago. But there we go. We have our answer. Who's on first? We also have the answer to what's on second, because there was a second baseman by the name of Watt who played with Washington in the 1920s before this routine became famous. But I can guarantee you this, the third baseman on that team, I don't give a darn, has never played a major league game. Now, a few years ago, I went up to Hyde Park, which isn't very far from where you are. And I wanted to go speak to Franklin Roosevelt, because I had some questions I had to ask him, like how come the Americans did go to Berlin for the Summer Olympics in 1936 and gave legitimacy to the Hitler regime? Or what happened? You're the first guy who was on television in the United States, real television, as opposed to the small experimental television station at the General Electric Labs in Schenectady. I want to ask him about being on TV on April 30th, 1939 at the World's Fair. And I also had one other thing to ask him about baseball and World War II and where baseball fit in World War II, because after December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, sends him a letter saying, what are we supposed to do? Now, we did cut the baseball season down in 1918 by a month. The American League just wanted to stop playing. The National League wanted to continue play, but they compromised, and there was a World Series between the American League team, the Boston Red Sox, and the National League team, the Chicago Cubs, with the Red Sox winning. It's a good thing for the Red Sox that the American League caved in and decided to play, and they won behind the left arm of Babe Ruth, who was a pitcher exclusively in those days, and he was the one who pitched them to the 1918 World Series win, and they would not win again until 2004. But that's another story for another day. The 1918 World Series was not pushed up because of the Spanish flu. It was done so because of World War I. So what are we supposed to do? Asked this man, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of baseball. Well, Roosevelt responds. It's called the green light letters. You go up to Hyde Park and you look around in the section of World War II, and you will find this letter. In the letter, how important baseball is to the American culture. And this is what Roosevelt wrote to Kennesaw Mountain Landis. I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. Baseball provides a recreation which does not last over 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Well, Roosevelt's been dead for the last 75 years, so he hasn't seen the Yankee Red Sox 4-hour 9-inning games, and which could be gotten for very little cost. Well, Roosevelt could afford, his class anyway, his family could afford the ticket prices of today. He's been dead 75 years. And incidentally, I hope that night games could be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see a game occasionally. Now, you didn't necessarily need lights in the western part of the Eastern time zone, and most of the teams were on this side. In fact, all the teams were on this side of the Mississippi, except for St. Louis at that time. So you didn't worry about night games. If they started at 7 o'clock, you could get them in by 9 o'clock in places like Detroit. But anyway, Roosevelt said, go ahead, play. And Dan Rooney, who is the president of the Pittsburgh Steelers, once told me that with that letter, he felt the National Football League could go, and the National Hockey League said the same thing, and whatever basketball organizations were going at that time decided to do the same, along with tennis and additionally golf and boxing. Although Joe Louis, who was a heavyweight champion, went into the service and did boxing exhibitions for the soldiers. Hank Greenberg was the first guy to enlist in World War II. Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was more than a baseball player. Babe Ruth tried to be an actor. Didn't really succeed all that well, but he was in 10 movies. 1920 movie called Heading Home starred Babe as what else? A baseball player. Stars in Babe Comes Home, a 1927 silent movie for which no print has survived. He also appeared in the Harold Lloyd silent movie Speedy. That was in 1928. He portrays himself in a cameo role, but it's a little more than a cameo role. Lloyd is a taxi driver. Babe is signing autographs, baseball autographs, calls the cabbie, come over here, take me to Yankee Stadium. It's a pretty good scene because Harold Lloyd is not a very good cab driver. Overall, Ruth was in 10 movies, the last one being Pride of the Yankees. But he was not the first baseball star ever to be in the movies. This guy, Mike Donlin, was really a baseball star. But that wasn't his main occupation. His main occupation was as an actor. And he took time away from baseball. Now he's a pretty good hitter. He batted .333 during the dead ball era. He was with the New York Giants, but took multiple breaks from the game because he was on stage. He was also in vaudeville. He retired for good in 1914 and goes right into the movies. And he's in a movie called Right Off the Bat, which coincidentally starred his New York Giant manager, John J. McGraw, who made a lot of movies. Probably McGraw would today be in commercials, but he made a lot of movies as the manager of the New York Giants. Donlin, they think, made at least 53 appearances on film. Baseball players were also in vaudeville at the time, Rube Marquardt being one of them. And they were in demand for movies, for vaudeville, because they were part of the American culture, and baseball was gaining rapid popularity. Lou Gehrig was in the movie. It was called Rawhide, 1938. And it's a pretty much forgettable movie, except for one thing. In 1939, Lou Gehrig is diagnosed with ALS. And his doctors hadn't really seen very much of ALS patients over the years. And they took a look at this movie. And one of the reasons they took a look at the movie, they wanted to see how Lou Gehrig walked, swung his arms at this particular time in 1938, and to see how rapidly the ALS was going through his body. So they had a baseline from, say, 1938 till his diagnosis, and then afterwards they were able to watch him. Gehrig and Ruth were instrumental in some medical research. Gehrig, of course, with the ALS through this movie, and Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was one of the first people ever to take chemotherapy. They experimented on him in 1947, 1948. He had the throat cancer, and Babe may have hit 714 home runs, but maybe more importantly, he was one of the, for lack of a better term, guinea pigs for chemotherapy, which initially worked for him and then didn't work for him. The movie Rawhide, totally forgettable. It opens with Gehrig announcing his retirement at Grand Central Terminal. He's gone from baseball. He can't deal with it anymore. There's too much pressure. And he's got to get away from New York. After all, he's a New York City boy who went to Columbia University, played with the New York Yankees, and had a place in New Rochelle. There was a place in New Rochelle called Lou Gehrig Way. Oddly enough, Gehrig's married, but he buys this ranch with his sister. With his sister. Why his sister? I can't tell you, but with his sister. So they could relax in solitude, because he's had more than enough, far more than enough. And he needs to get away. So he's going out to Montana, leaving New York City behind and spending the rest of his life as a rancher in Montana. Hey, Bugs Bunny was in a baseball movie. I learned most of the stuff I know in life from Warner Brothers cartoons. Bugs Bunny, who is probably the greatest comedic animated character ever done. And he's in right field, and he's heckling the Gas House Gorillas as they beat the Teetotalers, or beating the Teetotalers. And he's saying, I'll murder you guys with one arm behind my back. And you got to remember, Bugs Bunny was one of the most popular characters in the movies in the 1940s. In fact, his face was on bombs, because he was going to bomb Germany and he was going to bomb Japan. And he had that attitude about him. And he takes on the Gas House Gorillas, and he beats the Gas House Gorillas after they beat the Teetotalers. And he's got his carrot there and his carrot juice. Some of the movies, League of Their Own. This is an interesting movie in terms of, these are interesting people. Phil Wrigley, who was the head of Wrigley Gum, Spearmint, Juicy Fruit, all that other stuff, decided to put up some money around World War II for a women's professional league. And this is the story of the Women's Professional League, which lasted about 9 years. And I was covering sports back in the 1990s on radio for Mutual Radio. And I talked to Casey Candell, who was the second baseman of the Montreal Expos in the 1990s. And I found out that he was the technical advisor to this movie. And I said, well, what's your experience? And he said, my mother played in those leagues, those games. And he said that my mother wanted to make sure that it was correct, that the movie was correct, and she gave me all of her notes. And I basically made sure that they basically followed her notes. Now that's Madonna jumping into the arms of Rosie O'Donnell. Gina Davis is there with the chest protector, and who you don't see is Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks played a character based on the baseball slugger and Hall of Famer Jimmy Fox. He was the manager. And this movie, Tom Hanks, the character Tom Hanks is playing, says there's no crying in baseball. So League of Their Own, about women's baseball in the 1940s and 50s. There is Gary Cooper playing Lou Gehrig, Pride of the Yankees, which was the last movie that Babe Ruth appeared in. Gary Cooper was right-handed. He was also from Montana. He and Gehrig had nothing in common, except he played Gehrig. He never played baseball growing up as a kid in Montana. He was a rancher, and he was right-handed. All the scenes showing Cooper as Gehrig were done in the mirror to make it look like Cooper was left-handed. There is Bull Durham. There is Kevin Costner as Crash Davis. Nuke LaLoosh, Tim Robbins playing him. His character based on a guy by the name of Steve Dalkowski, him being the pitcher, Nuke. Dalkowski played with the Baltimore Orioles organization, or in the Baltimore Orioles organization. Ron Shelton, who wrote this movie, was his teammate. Dalkowski was a short guy who could throw a baseball through the wall, literally. Over 100 miles an hour, struck out a whole bunch of people, walked a whole bunch of people, never really did get a shot at Major League Baseball, closest he came, spring training. He also had problems off the field with alcoholism. And the character is based on him. And there's the baseball Annie, the groupie, played by Susan Sarandon. Crash Davis is allegedly the boyfriend, but she breaks in all the rookies. That's Bull Durham. And Max Pankin, who I knew, who is the clown prince of minor league baseball, reprised his real life role going around minor league baseball parks and doing comedy, including the Fountains routine that Sid Caesar did on Your Show of Shows. He was complaining about the movie. They loved being in the movie, but he did not get the girl, the baseball Annie, Susan Sarandon. Jerry Lewis, the Los Angeles Dodgers. Walter O'Malley moves the Dodgers out to Brooklyn. And all of a sudden, Brooklyn Dodgers, right in the middle of not only movies, but TV. And if you were a kid growing up in the 1960s, the way I was, you got to see a lot of Los Angeles Dodgers on television in the 1960s. This is the movie Geisha Boy that Jerry Lewis is in, and obviously he's directing the movie as well. He's talking to Pee Wee Reese about the scene that Jerry Lewis wants to shoot, and that was in Los Angeles. Up at the rock pile in Buffalo, War Memorial Stadium, that's Robert Redford in the movie The Natural, and I'm sure Jenny has the book The Natural somewhere within the library. Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner talking to Joe Jackson, who's thrown out of baseball in 1920 for allegedly throwing the 1919 World Series, the Chicago White Sox throwing it allegedly to the Cincinnati Reds. Joe Jackson appears in this cornfield talking to Kevin Costner. If you build it, they will come. Field of Dreams about baseball. Billy Beane, played by Brad Pitt. Billy Beane, the smartest guy in baseball, just ask him. Michael Lewis wrote a book called Moneyball based on what Billy Beane tried to do in bringing players analytically into the Oakland A's, and he was fairly successful at doing that. There was a movie based on that. Billy Beane was drafted by the New York Mets in 1980, and he turned down a scholarship at Stanford University and has been in baseball now about 40 years. Good-looking guy. In fact, he actually resembles Brad Pitt, or a younger Billy Beane resembled Brad Pitt. And that book, also Moneyball, should be in your library, Jenny. So anyway, another movie. It's probably the last big movie about baseball. And there's Walter Matthau in the Bad News Bears. Walter Matthau, who never did anything bad, whether he was in the play or in a movie, and he, of course, is the coach of the Bad News Bears, sponsored by Chico Bail Bonds. Major League, that's Major League 2, with Charlie Sheehan. It's 30 years old now, and the Cleveland Indians win the World Series. So that is Charlie Sheen. Now, another movie that was done was called Angels in the Outfield. And that is me in Pittsburgh 2 years ago, University of Pittsburgh. And I just took a tour of Shenley Park in the University of Pittsburgh. And there's the wall from Forbes Field that is still up there, right in the middle of the university. They have the old Forbes Field wall. And the reason I bring that up is because a movie was shot there called Angels in the Outfield. And I'm going to tell you why it was shot there in a second. Bill Veeck owned a small chunk of the Cleveland Indians in 1946. And he sold it to Bob Hope, the comedian Bob Hope. Hope was a native of Cleveland. Actually, he was born in England and he grew up in Cleveland. He was a fan of the baseball team, the Indians, and he jumped at the chance to own a small share of his hometown team. Hope's road partner was Bing Crosby. This same year, 1946, Bing Crosby invested in the Pittsburgh Pirates. There was a suggestion, let's do this movie called Angels in the Outfield. And Bing Crosby said, hey, it's a good idea. Why don't we do it in Pittsburgh? It's a beautiful park. And it was a beautiful park until it went into shambles toward the end of its life in the 1960s. And Bing got them to do Angels in the Outfield in Pittsburgh. So some of the movies, Pride of the Yankees, Bull Durham, Major League, Angels in the Outfield, Field of Dreams, The Geisha Boy, Bad News Bears, The Natural, Moneyball. And there was one other comedian who had a piece of a baseball team. His name, Danny Kaminsky, Danny K., whose father was my mother-in-law's dentist in the Bronx, way back when in the 1920s and 30s. He owned a piece of the Seattle Mariners in 1977. He also did baseball routines. Phil Foster did baseball routines back in the 1950s and 1960s. Question, Homer Simpson, Baseball Hall of Famer or not? I'll answer that in a few minutes, but baseball's immortalized 1992 in The Simpsons. Still going in 1992 as a major part of the culture, Homer Simpson scoring the winning run for the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant in their game against Major League All-Stars. Wilbur. Sandy Koufax was on Mr. Ed. Told you the Dodgers were beloved on television in the 1960s. Baseball and the culture. I'm not sure who Sandy Koufax is signing that autograph to, whether it's Mr. Ed or Alan Young, who played Wilbur, the talking horse, Mr. Ed. Herman Munster tried out for the Los Angeles Dodgers. That show was on for 2 years, 1964 and 65, the Munsters. And all of a sudden, there is Leo Durocher, the third base coach of the Los Angeles Dodgers, minding his own business, who walks by a neighborhood field, and Herman Munster is out there hitting fungos or hitting fly balls to his son, Eddie Wolfgang Munster, who's about 8, 9 years old. And Leo sees this, and he sees the power from the 7'6", 540-pound Herman Munster, and all of a sudden the third base coach, who never has a contract, and he wants Herman to try out for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Well, he does. There's a problem with that. Herman is 7'6", weighs 540 pounds, is a bit clumsy, runs into people, hurts people, and ultimately he is released from the Dodgers. Not the end of the story, because it's a TV show, and you have 24 minutes to fill up on the TV show back in those days. And so it's the season's turn, it's fall, and Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, the general manager of the Los Angeles Rams, happens to be walking by this field, and Herman's there punting, kicking footballs to Eddie Munster, his son, the All-American family. And all of a sudden, Crazy Legs Hirsch says, I got to sign this guy. And Leo, first of all, Leo Durocher, unless it was a day game, never woke up during the day, never woke up in the morning. He was a night owl. That was his life. He married Lorraine Day, who was a star in the 1940s. Leo comes running out of the bushes. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, Elroy. And the show ends, and Herman is neither a Dodger nor a Ram. Gilligan's Island. Gilligan's Island. The two guys there, the guy to the left on your screen is Jim Frenchie Lefevre. The guy to the right is Al Ferrara from Brooklyn, New York. Baseball and the culture again. Los Angeles Dodger players. Al Ferrara, who was born in 1939, once said he knew he made it to the major leagues when he saw his face on one of these, a baseball card. Jim Lefevre got involved with some acting in the 1960s, and the job here is they were cooking Gilligan and going to shrink his head. Once I asked Lefevre, I said, "You were on Gilligan's Island with a whole bunch of other people. How come nobody knew about the 7 stranded castaways?" He said, "And why? Ruin the show?" Jim Lefevre was second baseman with the Dodgers, Al Ferrara, an outfielder. That's Johnny Roseboro. Johnny Roseboro was the catcher of the Los Angeles Dodgers, and this is from Dragnet. Kind of looks Dragnet-like, doesn't it? The second run of Dragnet from 1967 to 1970. Walter O'Malley, the Dodger owner, appeared with the Rifleman star of the 1950s and the former Brooklyn Dodgers first baseman Chuck Connors in a 1965 show called Branded. The center fielder of the Dodgers, Willie Davis, acted in The Love Machine. He was in Jerry Lewis's Which Way to the Front and The Flying Nun. Roseboro was in Dragnet 1968, Burke's Law, Kraft Suspense Theater, Mr. Ed, and Experiment in Terror. The Dodgers were a hot commodity. Don Drysdale was on the Brady Bunch and other shows, the Donna Reed Show, the Dodgers and Hollywood. That was a love match in the 1960s. Now, the guy on the left, if I was in person, I would ask, do you know who the guy on the left is? But I'll tell you, the guy on the left is Phil Silvers. In the 1950s, Phil Silvers Show, or You'll Never Get Rich, or Sergeant Bilko, all the same show, 3 different titles depending on syndication. It was a major hit. The guy on the right is Steve Bilko. Steve Bilko was a great baseball player in the Pacific Coast League. Not quite good enough for the major leagues, but not too good for the Pacific Coast League. He bounced back and forth between the major leagues and the Pacific Coast League. He was a prolific home run hitter for the Los Angeles Dodgers of the Pacific Coast League. He ended up his career with the Los Angeles Angels of the American League. But anyway, Nat Hiken, who was the guy who wrote and produced the Bilko Show, was sitting and watching a game one day out in Los Angeles, minor league game, and he sees Steve Bilko. That's the guy. That's the guy I want as the name of my show, The Bilko Show. And there is Phil Silvers on the left, Steve Bilko on the right. He wasn't the only baseball player who had a major character named after him in a television show. Some of the television shows were Donna Reed, Brady Bunch, Mr. Ed, Phil Silvers Show, also known as Bilko, which means I could also talk about Yogi. The first Yogi story. I spoke at Yogi Berra's museum a lot. Yogi used to pat me on the back. And I decided one day to ask Yogi about being on the Bilko Show. And the Bilko Show supposedly takes place at Fort Baxter, which is in the middle of Kansas, nowhere Kansas, and they're an army platoon in the middle of Kansas. I said to Yogi, I said, "Hey, Yogi, what were you and your Yankee teammates doing in the middle of Kansas on the Bilko Show?" He says to me, we did it in the Bronx. I said, "Yeah, I know where you shot it, but I want to know, why were you in the middle of Kansas?" He said, "We were in the middle of Kansas. I left my house. I went across the George Washington Bridge, a couple exits. We got off. There was the studio. We walked on. That was it." I said, "Yeah." And then I said, "You know what? You're right, Yogi. It was in Kansas." Phil Silvers Show. Aaron Spelling, who made every schlock show that was ever done on TV. Love Boat, Fantasy Island, Charlie's Angels, you name it, he did it. Anyway, he was looking for a main character in his show, The Love Boat. And he decided to take the baseball encyclopedia, because he did that, naming TV characters after people in the encyclopedia of baseball. And he stumbles upon the name Moose Stubing of the Bronx, New York. Moose Stubing. He stumbles upon that name. He says, "That's it. That's it. That's the guy that I want. That's the name I want for the main character of Love Boat, Captain Stubing." Now, John Forsythe was on Charlie's Angels back in the mid-1970s. This is where maybe life imitates art or art imitates life. John Forsythe was on Charlie's Angels. He was the voice of Charlie. You never saw him, but he was the voice of Charlie. Great voice, great voice. he landed his first paying job as the ballpark announcer at Ebbets Field for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1950s. And of course, he would star in one of Spelling's biggest hits ever, the lead character, Dynasty, in the 1980s. There he is. That is Moose Stubing, who eventually became the manager of the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, but they were known as the California Angels in those days. And I asked him, did you ever get any money out of it? He says, no, but I know it was me. And there is John Forsythe playing baseball. Los Angeles Dodgers, when they used to bring the actors and actresses in to play softball. And there he is with Jack Lemmon taking a picture of John Forsythe. And there's Mr. Baseball, Bob Uecker, on the Johnny Carson show. And if you made it to the couch or made it to the seat next to Johnny as a comedian, well, you had it made. You made it. I have a friend by the name of Wayne Cotter who made it to Johnny's seat. And sometimes he got on the show and Johnny just invited him on as a guest, didn't do it as a routine. Uecker's story is interesting. He's a catcher with the Milwaukee Braves. They moved to Atlanta. He's traded to St. Louis and then to Philadelphia, and then the Braves hire him after his playing career. He's in the South, and he's doing stand-up comedy all through the South, and he's in Atlanta, and the trumpet player, Al Hirt, sees him, and he thinks he is the funniest guy going on. And Hirt sees him, and immediately he calls Johnny Carson. And Johnny, you got to get this guy on the show. It's, what's his name? It's Bob Uecker. Never heard of him. He said, believe me, he's funny. Johnny, you know me. I would never give you anybody who would embarrass you. Uecker gets on the show, and he kills, absolutely kills, and he's invited to the seat. Johnny leans over to him during the break and says, is it true that you play baseball? Yes, it is. After that, Johnny nicknamed him Mr. Baseball. And with that, he would become a star of the Miller Lite commercials, must be in the front row, and eventually would get a TV show called Mr. Belvedere in 1984, where he is one of the lead characters as a sports writer. Whatever Lola wants, Lola gets. Damn Yankees, which hit Broadway in the 1950s, all about the Yankees winning too much and Washington not winning. Although that wasn't true in the mid-1950s, because Washington won the World Series in 1933, and it was only a 20-year drought by that point. But Joe Hardy, the character in Damn Yankees, sells his soul to the devil so that the Senators could beat the Yankees. There were two songs in that play. One of them was Whatever Lola Wants, Lola Gets, and the other, You Gotta Have Heart. And you gotta have heart, because there is Ed Sullivan honoring the 1969 New York Mets World Championship team. What you don't know is Jerry Stiller was my cousin. And of course, Stiller and Mira were on the Sullivan Show more than 36 times. And Jerry and I have talked a lot about, or had talked because he passed away earlier this year, about being on the Sullivan Show. And I do a talk called The Early Days of TV, where I talk about Jerry. There's going to be a segue here about Jerry in about 1 minute. But there is Ed, who started his career as a sports writer with the New York Daily News almost 100 years ago now. And one of his jobs was at the Golden Gloves as the ring announcer for the amateur boxing tournament. Where they dropped down the microphone, and Ed would say, in this corner, so-and-so, in that corner, so-and-so. If you remember the Ed Sullivan Show, you are watching a guy who got his start in public being a ring announcer, and he used that technique on his show. And some of those 69 Mets are still around. Art Shamsky with the double-breasted suit, closest to Ed on the front row on the left side. Ron Swoboda, one of my favorite players. In fact, I still talk to Art occasionally. Ron Swoboda is in New Orleans, still doing some work and writing books down there. Tom Seaver, who passed away, second row on the right. Tug McGraw, one of my favorite people. His curveball was called the Bo Derek because it had a little tail on it. And his fastball, the Peggy Lee, for that's all there is. But Jerry Stiller told me a lot about Ed Sullivan, and Sullivan has the Mets on in 1969. Now, speaking of Jerry Stiller, of course, he plays Frank Costanza on the Seinfeld Show. And Frank Costanza is involved with one of these stories. Now, George Steinbrenner, the players weren't getting on shows, but George Steinbrenner, the owner of the Yankees, hosted Saturday Night Live. And there's one skit where he plays every position. He's the manager, he's the coach, the general manager, along with being the owner. And come to think of it, wasn't very far from real life. The other thing on Saturday Night Live was Chico Escuela. Baseball's been very, very good to me. Excuse me. And in St. Petersburg, a game between the Mets and Yankees, preseason game. Jerry, yeah, thanks. Anyway, Jerry Stiller, Chico Escuela is there, and he's talking about his days with the Mets. It's all part of Saturday Night Live. They had this character, Chico Escuela, a Hispanic character who says, baseball's very, very good to me. But now, talking about Seinfeld and Steinbrenner, I'm going to let you in on a little secret that Jerry Stiller told me and a whole bunch of Yankee officials told me. George Steinbrenner suggested ideas for storylines to Larry David. And some of them were converted into stories, including one that had my cousin Jerry Stiller a major part of. Storyline suggested by George Steinbrenner. Missing George, board meeting moved, different uniforms. Missing George. Missing George, the episode, if you're a Seinfeld fan, you know what it's about. It's about when George Costanza goes missing. George Steinbrenner presumes he's dead, goes to Frank Costanza's house to say, I think your son George is dead. And Frank Costanza looks at him and says, you traded Jay Buhner for Ken Phelps. The story was basically about a guy who worked at American Ship, which was George's company in Tampa. It was a guy that George thought hung around with bad people, and George was always afraid for his health for whatever reason. And there's one weekend that the cars left in the American Ship parking lot, American Shipping, and George comes in early on Monday, and the car is still there, and the guy is not at work. And George all of a sudden and thinks something happened to this guy who was his worker. And he calls up the Tampa, Florida Police Department, who puts out an all-points bulletin looking for him. Well, shows up later saying, I just went away for the weekend. That was turned into a story. George actually called the cops looking for this guy. Board meeting moved. If you knew anything about George Steinbrenner, well, let me tell you one thing about George Steinbrenner. If he saw food that he liked on your plate, your food was his food too. There is a board meeting, and George Steinbrenner in Seinfeld says, Big Stein smells food, Big Stein smells food. And he picks up the meeting, and they go elsewhere around Yankee Stadium. Happened. They wanted a calzone. Different uniforms. They used different uniforms. The farm team in Tampa, some sort of cotton polyester type uniforms. They shrunk. George tried it out. It was a storyline for the Steinbrenner show. George actually went on the Seinfeld show. It was terrible. Go up to YouTube. The scene is up there. You judge if it's terrible or not. It's terrible. Here he is with Julia Louis-Dreyfus. It's just terrible. It doesn't work. Seinfeld actually said he did a scene in the show. It was terrible. We couldn't use him. We cut him out. He wasn't funny. I don't remember exactly what went wrong with it, but it was quite an awkward situation. George Steinbrenner actually did like the show. Didn't at first. His grandchildren said it's a great show. George became heavily involved. So heavily involved, he helped write scripts. Keith Hernandez of the Mets. He wasn't with the Mets. He was retired at this point. He's on the Seinfeld show. Jerry and Keith become good friends. George Costanza becomes very jealous at that point. And that's the whole storyline. There's other things in there as well. After all, it's a show about nothing. Keith said his agent, Scott Boras, asked him if he wanted to be on Seinfeld. Boras is still around, by the way. And he said, what's that? And Scott said, hey, they fly out first class. You're up in a nice hotel for a week, and they give you 15 grand. Keith was ready to play himself on the show. He did 2 episodes on the 3 episodes on the show. And Seinfeld and Keith are best of buddies after that to this day. Wally Pipp. Now, I kind of wondered about Wally Pipp, but I was watching Jeopardy last night, season opener for Jeopardy. And there was a question about Wally Pipp. And I'm saying, I can keep it in there. If it's in Jeopardy, I can keep Wally Pipp in there. And it was Jeopardy because the answer was, this man replaced Wally Pipp as the first baseman of the New York Yankees because Wally Pipp had a headache. And of course, the answer is, who is Lou Gehrig? And it was the 3rd answer of the category. I don't remember if it's the 1st or 2nd, so it was either $600 or $1,200. But Wally Pipp still exists 95 years later in culture, in Jeopardy. Wally Pipp, the myth, lost his job to Lou Gehrig, June 2nd, 1925, because of a headache. There's a moral to this story. Don't ever call in sick because somebody else will do your job, and they may do it better. Actually, it was made up. The Yankees decided they were going to give Lou Gehrig the opportunity. Pipp was benched. Pipp would go on to play with the Detroit Tigers and the minor league Newark Bears, where he made more money than he did with the New York Yankees. But Wally Pipp of all people, was on Jeopardy. 95 years later, last night, season opener, year 37. Cigarettes in baseball were a big deal. There was Babe Ruth. If you look closely, it looks like Babe Ruth is sitting in the old Sparky at Sing Sing, about ready to get electrocuted. He pitched Old Gold cigarettes, not a cough in a carload. Old Gold's mildness and smoothness marked it right off the bat as the best. Bull Durham, they sponsored cigarettes. Bull Durham became a movie later on. Chesterfield, always buy Chesterfield, ABC, the baseball man cigarette. Hey, Bucky Harris smokes it. Bob Elliott, Ted Williams, well, we don't know if he smokes it or not. Stan Musial, looks like somebody pushed a cigarette, knocked out a tooth, pushed a cigarette in there. Joe DiMaggio, guaranteed, never paid for that. Yul Blackwell, the Cincinnati Reds pitcher, always buy Chesterfield. When you change to Chesterfield, the first thing you will notice is their mildness. That's because of the right combination, world's best tobacco. ABC, always milder, better tasting, cooler smoking. If you went to the Polo Grounds, you saw the scoreboard up there, always buy Chesterfield. Yogi again. Joe Garagiola once told me about Yogi. When Yogi stepped in it, he stepped in it. Yoo-hoo. I never liked Yoo-hoo. I don't know how many of you had Yoo-hoo. Tasted like chocolate water, but Yogi drank it. I don't know if Mickey drank it. Might have thrown some scotch in there. Moose Skowron, one of my favorite people. Moose Skowron, first baseman then of the Washington Senators. It's 1964. Moose was a Yankee teammate, Elston Howard with the Yankee, the drink of champions. Well, when Garagiola said he stepped in it, I'm going to show you why. Yogi meets the Oliveri family. They're putting out Yoo-hoo. Not much success. This is 1955. Yogi's at a country club. They're having a lot of problems getting this on the shelves in supermarkets. Yogi tastes the drink, and the Oliveris with bated breath ask, well, what do you think? Yogi's on board. So much so that he goes down to the office and helps out. One time I was in the office and the phone rang. No one else is around. They always answer a ringing phone, so I did. The woman who was calling asked me if Yoo-hoo was hyphenated. I said, no, ma'am. It's not even carbonated. That's a story from Dave Kaplan. You might have Dave's book with Yogi in the library, Jenny, called 10 Rings. Dave ran the museum, the Yogi Berra Museum, and he told me some of these stories, which were very funny. No, ma'am, it's not even carbonated. Hey, Yogi. Yogi sold Italian dressing. For me, it's got everything. Sure makes swell salads. Kraft's Italian dressing. Hey, I remember the days. I had a car that had a battery that I had to put water in. I was 17 years old. It was an old station wagon. Yogi Berra said I add water only 3 times a year. Press the light. High-level battery. Needs water only 3 times a year. My car, 1973. I'm 17 years old. I have to put water in the battery. Yogi said, buy a Press the Light. Yogi was selling beer. Oh, he was selling beer. He was selling the Miller Lite beer, part of the Miller Lite All-Stars that included Bob Uecker and Marvelous Marv Throneberry of the 1962 New York Mets. Why I'm doing this commercial, I don't know. Yogi also, this Christmas, asked Mom and Dad for a Shelby bike, the winner's bike. He's pitching bikes. I like Shelby because it's the slickest, streamlined bike on the road. Yogi's teammate Joe DiMaggio guaranteed he didn't pay for that cigarette, that drink, or whatever else he got at the Stork Club. And of course, Joe D. and Marilyn Monroe, the love story, the jock and the actress, 1954. You might have another book in the library, Jenny, called Me and Joe by Morris Engelberger, which was co-written by my friend, the late Marv Schneider, who went out and did talks like this in person. And 11 pages on Joe and Marilyn. He did about 4 years worth of talks on 11 pages about this particular love story. January 14th, 1954, Joe D. and Marilyn elope in San Francisco. 10 months later, Marilyn Monroe files for divorce, citing only mental cruelty. There may have been more to the story than that. This is Stamford, Connecticut, back in 2017, and that's 26-foot Marilyn that I'm in front of. And behind there is the First Congregational Church, and to my left and Marilyn's left, there's another church. They put that thing in strategically, so when you walked out of the church, you saw the skirt lift up, or if you walked out of the left side of the church, you saw her halter top as you walked out. Stamford, Connecticut. There were complaints from people in Stamford, Connecticut. But that's from 7 Year Itch, and DiMaggio happened to be on the set that day. And that night was a rough night in the DiMaggio Marilyn Monroe household. Joe made a few requests of his wife. He wanted her to be a stay-at-home wife, stay-at-home mom, if possible. 2, he did not want a wife who did not cook him dinner. He wanted dinner every day, same time. 3, he didn't want a wife making more money than him. And 4, he didn't want a wife more famous than him. Other than that, they were a totally compatible couple. Joe D. And Marilyn were supposedly going to get back together in 1961-62. She had the mental problems and eventually would commit suicide. And I speak on cruise ships. There was a guy who was an LAPD retired detective in 2008 who said he worked the entertainment sector of Los Angeles, where the entertainers work, like Judy Garland, and he said it was just a junkie mixing alcohol and pills. Songs, Mrs. Robinson or Mrs. Roosevelt, We Didn't Start the Fire. Mrs. Robinson, Paul Simon, We Didn't Start the Fire, Billy Joel, Joltin' Joe from the 1940s. Duke Ellington, Did You See Jackie Hit That Ball? And Mickey by Teresa Brewer. You've probably heard this song 15,000 times. Mrs. Robinson, Where Have You Gone, Joe DiMaggio? There are 2 versions of this story that I am going to give you. One of them from former New York Yankees who told me the story. One of them from the Dick Cavett Show, and it's still up on video, the Dick Cavett Show. Number 1 comes from Johnny Blanchard talking about the meeting between dinner between Joe DiMaggio and Paul Simon, who wrote the song Simon and Garfunkel. Now, Paul Simon is writing this song for Mike Nichols in The Graduate, and he has this little snatch of a song that's 37 seconds long. You know the song. And people say, make it longer, make it longer, make it longer. So he's making it longer. And he's just writing, has really nothing to do with the song initially, and he's just writing and looking for an American hero in the song. Somebody he could just throw into the song, and in a little bit about The Graduate. And so he meets Joe, and Johnny Blanchard, who was the backup catcher of the Yankees, said that Joe walks in and he has dinner with Paul Simon. He said, where have I gone? What do you mean, where have I gone? I'm right here. I'm eating with you. I did a Bowery commercial the other day. I'm selling Mr. Coffee. What do you mean, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? And Paul Simon decides to go intellectual on him. And he says, well, I was looking for an American hero, and I thought of Eleanor Roosevelt. Then I thought of Ted Williams. Then I thought of you, and you were my hero because in 1951 I was 10 years old, and that was the last time you played, and I didn't see you anymore. So where did you go? I wanted to know where you went. You just went away. And they had dinner, and at the end of dinner, Joe DiMaggio accepted whatever he accepted, and they went on their ways. He's on the Dick Cavett show, he being Paul Simon. He says, I said that I didn't mean the lines literally. I thought of him as an American hero, and that genuine heroes were in short supply. He accepted the explanation and thanked me. We shook hands and said good night. And then the next question from Dick Cavett. Why was DiMaggio's name instead of Mickey Mantle? Mantle and DiMaggio hated one another, absolutely hated one another. Joe D, 1951, 37 years old. He's looking to his left. He sees this chiseled, blonde, beautiful man to his left in right field who could run like the wind, good looking, everything Joe couldn't be at that point in his life. And he's jealous. Meanwhile, Mickey is looking at Joe DiMaggio. World Series in 1951. Fly ball hit to right center field. Mickey is running like the wind, and he trips over a drain or a sprinkler at Yankee Stadium, tears up his knee. DiMaggio, he says, is loafing after the ball. What happens after that? Mickey hates Joe. Joe already hates Mickey over jealousy. They can't stand each other. So Dick Cavett says to Paul Simon, why wasn't Mantle's name used instead of DiMaggio? All about the syllables, Dick. It's about how many beats there are. That's Terry Cashman. He and I share the same periodontists. Became baseball's balladeer in the 1980s. Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, talking baseball, his big baseball song. By the way, if you're a Jim Croce fan, Terry Cashman right now is working on a Jim Croce anthology. Terry was his producer, and they're going to come out with a box set of Jim Croce's released stuff and also his unreleased stuff that should be coming out soon. Anyway, there's something wrong with this picture. Oh yeah, there's Duke, and there's Willie, and there's Mickey. Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. But there's no Joe DiMaggio. He is in this picture. It was taken in Shea Stadium in the mid-1970s, New York's greatest living center fielders walking in from the bullpen, or rather the center field gates to the middle of the baseball diamond. Joe's not there. Talking Baseball, 1981 song written and performed by Terry Cashman. Joe's in the photograph. He is left out of the song, airbrushed from the record picture sleeve, probably for the better. There's Phil Rizzuto. Phil Rizzuto, one of my favorite people. Phil is in Baseball's Hall of Fame, and he has a gold record. Meatloaf, I'm down here in Westchester. I used to see him occasionally. He coached his girls' softball team, and I used to see him at Yankee Stadium occasionally. And he wanted Phil Rizzuto for his song, Paradise by the Dashboard Light, for the album Bat Out of Hell, written by Jim Steinman. And they wanted Phil. And they wanted Phil, the baseball announcer, not Phil, the thespian, like George Steinbrenner was in Seinfeld. And they say, Phil, just be Phil. Just be Phil, just be Phil. Just be the play-by-play guy, Phil Rizzuto. They tape it up in Boston, his segment. It takes about 100 takes. Rizzuto provides the play-by-play of a broadcast. The player's aggressive base running nearly gets him called out a few times, at second, at third, and at home. Eventually, he would try for the suicide squeeze on his way home. Scooter never knew that the song was about sex. It was about teenagers, about a guy and a girl and the guy's desire for the girl. His kids were going to school at Boston in the late 1970s, at university in the late 1970s. And they said, hey, Dad, you know that song's about sex. Holy cow, that Huckleberry fooled me. Yes, he did. This is the same guy who was talking to Bill White during a game, and Bill White's talking about how a pitcher is in, some pitcher had good rhythm, and Phil said to him, you know, me and Cora, his wife Cora, we use the rhythm method. Baseball cards. Part of the culture, baseball cards. Big part of the culture. Scarred me for life, 1964, Mrs. Charles. She stole my baseball cards. We're all around, you know, we're all little kids having our baseball cards. She took them all away. And I'm giving a talk in Roseland, New Jersey about 12 years ago. It's a senior's home, and I'm talking about my sordid story about baseball cards, how it left a scar in my life that Mrs. Charles took my cards away in 1964 and everybody else's cards. And there's a woman sitting at the end, and she's slinking in the chair. And I said, "You, Mrs. Charles?" I had to do it. I had to do what? I had to take the baseball cards. Why? Well, I was dating this guy, and he had a 6-year-old son, and I wanted the kid to like me. I took my baseball cards to give to this kid. 5 cents. 5 cards, 5 cents. Stick of bubble gum. Cy Berger invented that. Many periodontists and oral surgeons are very happy about that because that bubble gum ruined a lot of kids' teeth. Anyway, 5 cents. What happened? Did he like you? We broke up. What? Broke up? You took my cards away. Can you see how it scarred me? Baseball cards were cool, actually, back in the day. Under the right set of circumstances, you could learn how to use the back of the card there, see the back of the card, to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Favorite baseball player. It's up 10 times, has 3 hits. 3 into 10 equals 300. Multiply, gamble as well. Gambling. Many people don't realize that gambling, you did that. This is your first entree into gambling. You were gambling your cards, trying to win his cards, her cards, getting cards back. Also geography, trying to figure out where the player played. And they were great for bicycle flaps. You could put a clothespin in it, put them around your tires, and they made great swirling noises. That was baseball and the culture. Baseball and the culture has suffered. New generation, young kids. No new songs for them, no new literature, no new movies. Just another sport. No new big movies, I should say. Question, Homer Simpson in baseball's Hall of Fame, yes or no? The answer is yes. For that episode, nuclear power plant, Springfield nuclear power plant. It's there with Casey at the bat. John Fogerty's song from 1985, Center Field, League of Their Own, and Abbott and Costello's Who's on First. That's Joe Namath. That's when I had hair back in 1988. Me and Bruce Morton interviewing Joe. Joe cemented the Super Bowl, winning in 1969. Jets beating the Baltimore Colts. Joe guaranteeing the Super Bowl. Puts the Super Bowl on another level. Baseball continues to decline from there. Although baseball's decline started in 1965, football overtook it. 1950, it was baseball here. Horse racing, boxing. That dominated American sports. By 1965, football, according to the Harris Poll, surpassed baseball, most popular sport in America. Muhammad Ali in May 1985, last time I could dealt with him because he couldn't speak because of Parkinson's. He couldn't say boxing. Boxing also went into a spiral. Gulfstream Park in Florida. Horse racing now lives because of casinos. That's Jim Bouton and me. Jim Bouton wrote Ball 4, the quintessential baseball book. Comes out in 1970. Jenny, you have to have that in the library. Ball 4, where Jim Bouton humanized players. Mickey Mantle drank. Other things. Baseball players had problems with their wives, problems with their lives, all in that book. Ball 4. My favorite baseball book came out 50 years ago in June. Humanized the players. One of the 20 most influential books of the 20th century, according to the New York Public Library, and maybe, Jenny, your library as well. Used as part of the arbitration when Peter Seitz ended the reserve clause in 1976. Soccer. Soccer has come into prominence, which it wasn't when I was a kid, but I'm in a soccer movie. The soccer movie is called Sons of Ben. And that was the red carpet down in Philadelphia at the Trocadero Comedy Club, where the movie was premiered, Sons of Ben, in 2015, and I'm in it. Interesting movie that I was in, and that's the red carpet in Philadelphia. It ain't over until it's over. Well, it's over almost, but it ain't over yet. Yogi Berra has been quoted more times before the United States Supreme Court than anybody else in the history of the court. You see a fork in the road, take it. His friend Joe Garagiola. Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore. It's too crowded. It gets late early here. Left field at Yankee Stadium with the shadows at Yankee Stadium during the World Series time. Talking to his wife, Carmen. Carmen says to Yogi, Yogi, Tim went to see Dr. Zhivago today. Yogi, what's wrong with him today? Lots of yogiisms. Dave Kaplan wrote a book about yogiisms. Half of what I said, I really didn't say. Anyway, Mike Dyer got Yogi to say it ain't over until it's over in 1973. And I kind of hope that you're not built up for a great story, because this is not a great story. Mike Dyer, who I know, who lives in Sarasota, Florida now, 78 years old, was covering the Mets back in 1973. Not a particularly good year for the Mets throughout most of the year in 1973. But somehow, despite all the injuries, they hung in there. That was the year that M. Donald Grant gave a pep talk to the team, and Tug McGraw came yelling out, you gotta believe, you gotta believe, you gotta believe. Time's running out on the Mets, and their injured players are coming back in September. And they're getting closer, but the games are running out on them. They don't have very many opportunities to screw up. And they do screw up. And the Long Island Press reporter, Mike Dyer, is in with a whole bunch of newspaper reporters after the game at Shea Stadium in 1973. The Mets lose. And Mike Dyer says to Yogi Berra, time's running out. Is it over? And Yogi says, it ain't over till it's over. I want to thank Jenny for inviting me. I hope that you enjoyed the talk. And Peter, thank you. And Joanne, thank you. This talk will be available to you, so you can put it through your social media, whether it's your website, Facebook, Twitter, or whatever other account. And if you have any questions, type them in, or I'll unmute everybody so that you can say anything. I see that we have lost somebody. Let's see. Let me see if I can get you to unmute.
I'm unmuted. Joanne's unmuted.
Okay. Hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, I did. Yeah. You know, what baseball team do you like? I don't see a hat or a shirt or nothing here.
Oh, I've been a reporter for so long that they're just players to me.
Oh, I'm a Met fan.
You're a Met, so you must be happy that the Wilpons have sold the team, or are about ready to sell.
Yeah. Well, but how will I get this on? My other half really loves the Mets, and he's in the hospital right now. So.
I will send you a copy.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to send you a copy. I will send you a copy for the library to use, and I'll send a copy for you and Joanne, and you can put it out on Twitter, and it's obviously your library. And I found out that libraries, it's much better for them to put it out on social media, and they get a lot more viewers.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Evan. So sorry about the audio issues before.
Oh, well, these things happen. Anyway, thank you so much